Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley, and I am one of the team here at the Training Accreditation Council, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar on awarding credit. The information provided in this webinar to TAC regulated RTOs and may not apply to you if you are regulated by ASQA or the VRQA. It is recommended that you speak to your regulator for further information. At this time, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region.
Thank you very, very much, Mel. And thank you so much for organising this and all the work that you do in maintaining this education program. So welcome, everybody. It's really good that you're here with us today to talk about awarding credit because it's an important aspect of an RTO's function. It's an important service to provide to learners. So it's important that this is managed in a way which is both consistent and credible and preserves the integrity of our competency-based assessment system and the training products. There are a number of documents that you can access. One, of course, is the PowerPoint handout for today's session. The second is the TAC special bulletin, awarding credit for equivalent units of competency, which is available through the TAC website if you haven't already downloaded a copy of that. There is also an awarding credit fact sheet and a training product equivalence fact sheet. And all of those will be referenced from one time or another during today's session. If not perhaps formally, you'll recognize that we are taking ideas and concepts and principles and rules from those documents. And of course, the primary document is always the Standards for RTOs 2015. So what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, what is credit and when is credit possible? So we'll have a quick look at that, and it really is important that we understand the function of credit and how credit works within a competency-based system where we have units of competency that define outcome standards. So we then need to ask the question, what does equivalent mean? Because one of the ideas within the context of this webinar is that credit can be granted for equivalent units as well as for the actual units, but there are conditions in relation to that, so we need to understand the concept of equivalence. That takes us, of course, to awarding credit where successive versions are equivalent. And there's a question mark after that because it's basically saying, can you do it? And if you can, how can you do it? And if you can't, when can't you do it? And that becomes a big issue when we are looking at awarding credit when equivalent units or modules have been superseded twice or more. The process that we're going to look at involves mapping, and so we need to ask ourselves the question, where does equivalence break down and what sort of gaps might there be, how we could identify gaps through mapping, and how we might respond to gaps when we see that the two units of competency, a unit that is currently a requirement of a training product and a unit that has been presented by a learner seeking credit. And within the whole of this, we'll be referencing back to those fundamental frameworks and principles and guidelines developed by the Training Accreditation Council. So the first question really, and the obvious question, is what is credit? Basically credit is a process to meet current training package requirements with a previously achieved unit of competency or module. And those requirements could be a prerequisite, could be a core unit, could be a named elective unit, but basically it's a way of enabling a person to utilize a previously achieved unit of competency as credit for a current training product requirement. This would mean that the learner does not have to repeat the unit or module and can transfer the unit or module from previous learning at the RTO or at another RTO and have it counted towards achieving the requirements of a training product. And this concept is enshrined in Standard 3.5 of the standards for RTOs. And it fundamentally says that the RTO accepts and provides credit for learners for units of competency and or modules, where these are evidenced by the AQF certification documentation issued by another RTO or an AQF authorized issuing organization, such as a USI transcript, or an authenticated vet transcript issued by the registrar, which of course is the USI transcript. But note in parenthesis, it says that you can't award credit if licensing or regulatory requirements prevent it. And so you need to make sure that if you are involved with a course leading to the potential to apply for a license, then under those circumstances, you would have to make a different decision if the licensing or regulatory requirements forbade the use of the unit of the former unit of competency for credit. So fundamentally, what we have is a situation where an individual basically says, "I think I've already got this competency." If they actually have the unit of competency, then the issue is straightforward, and you don't, under those circumstances, have a decision to make. So if the student provides evidence that they hold the current unit of competency and or module that would serve as a prerequisite or as a core unit or as a nominated elective unit, then there's no issue. Fundamentally, under Standard 3.5, you're required to accept that unit and the student will not need to repeat that unit. The other circumstance where credit is possible is where the student provides evidence that they hold the superseded equivalent unit of competency or module that reflecting the current unit or module outcomes. Now, that raises an interesting question, because some units of competency that are superseded themselves supersede and have superseded units. So you can get a chain of units of competency moving down. And that's one of the issues that we're going to look at today, because when the unit of competency that is in the current training product names a unit of competency, and that unit of competency names an equivalent unit, then you can use that named equivalent unit, that equivalent superseded unit, as a basis for credit. We'll have a look at that in a moment in more detail, but first we need to ask the question, what does this word equivalent mean? And this goes back, it takes us back to the training package products policy. That is the document that is used by training package developers to develop competency standards and training products. And fundamentally, what it says within the framework of the current version of the training package products policy is that the training package developers must declare a qualification equivalent if or a former version of a qualification is equivalent to a new version of the qualification if the occupational outcomes and AQF level described by the two qualifications hasn't changed. So fundamentally, it's basically saying two qualifications will be equivalent if the work outcomes of the two qualifications are precisely the same. And that, of course, relates to the content made up of units of competency and the AQF level of the qualification itself. They also have to declare for each unit of competency whether the previous version is judged or deemed to be equivalent to the new version. And so a new unit of competency is judged to be equivalent to a superseded unit of competency, or perhaps it's more proper to say the superseded unit is declared to be equivalent to the new unit if the work outcome described by the two units has not changed. So what you can see here is equivalence basically means that the qualification is functionally the same as the previous version, or the unit of competency is functionally the same as its previous version. When you actually look at what it talks about in terms of the training package products policy, it talks about doing an analysis. That is not you, although we're going to suggest that you do need to do this, but it's the requirement of the training package developers to do a mapping of the old unit and its superseding unit to determine that it has the same elements, performance criteria, performance evidence, and knowledge requirements. And that basically means that you are able to judge whether the work outcome of 2 units of competency hasn't changed because the content of the unit of competency. This is reported in each unit of competency. So if you look at the bottom of the screen in rather small text, it basically has here for a unit of competency, conduct civil construction, skid steer, loader operations. It has, this particular unit is the F version of RII MPO 318F. And it basically has a little section in the unit of competency called mapping. And if you look into the mapping, it says that this new unit, the F version, is equivalent to the E version. Conduct civil construction, skid steer, grader operations, or loader operations, I beg your pardon, loader operations. And it then goes on to say there are minor updates to reflect changes in operator maintenance and relocation activities. So they're not exactly the same, but what the training package developers are saying is these are functionally the same. That is, if you have the E version, you'll be able to function effectively as a civil construction skid steer loader operator. You'll be able to function in an equivalent way to a person who has the new unit of competency. And that's a judgment made by experts. It's not a judgment that we need to make as RTOs because it's already printed in the training package. And it basically says that if a person is coming to you with the old version of this unit of competency, you can award credit for the current unit of competency. I need to stress here that I'm saying you award them the new unit. What I'm saying is that that old unit can be used as part of a skill set or as part of a qualification where the new unit is required. So if we move on to the question that then arises is what can you do when there are successive versions that are equivalent? And so if you look at this particular example here, and we'll be touching on this later on, the F version is preceded by an E version, which in turn is preceded by a D version, which was preceded by a B version, going back to 2013. So if we are looking at successive versions, we have to ask how far can we go? And the position is that RTOs can automatically award credit using the equivalent determination where the unit or module attained by the learner immediately precedes the unit or module for which credit will be awarded. That basically says, because it says immediately precedes, it basically means that what it says in the mapping for the current unit would be allowable for credit. And that's an important distinction because what we're basically saying is the unit tells you what can be used for credit. It's written there, it's in the mapping. Of course, if it says that it's not equivalent, then you can't use it as a credit. Only if it says it is credit, it is equivalent. So awarding credit when equivalent units or modules have been superseded twice or more becomes a bit of a challenge because when we look at the current unit of competence, it does not mention other units of competency, only the one that immediately precedes it, and only where it says it is equivalent. So we are in a situation where if it, as the previous slide said, if it immediately precedes the current version, then you can use it for credit if it's equivalent. But when we start looking at units of competency that have been superseded more than once, such as the example that we're using today, then we run into a significant problem. there might be a very small change between the F version and the E version, but the change between the E version and the D version might be small, but the difference between the D version and the F version could now be much larger. And so there becomes an issue of a kind of Chinese whispers problem, and I'll come back to that a bit later on, where a message is gradually changing so that it's each change is small, but the overall change is large. So fundamentally, the rule that is being applied is that where a unit of competency is superseded twice or more, you must conduct a mapping process to confirm no gaps exist in the content and learning outcomes between the unit and or the module already attained by the learner and the unit and or module for which the learner seeks an award of credit. And where the mapping process identifies gaps in the content and learning outcomes, no award of credit can be provided. So what we're saying fundamentally here is you can't be confident that when something has been superseded twice or more, that the changes are no longer minor but now are significant, and therefore you can't be confident that credit can be automatically awarded. So what we're looking at there is chains of equivalent units. I mentioned before a game. It's known as the Whisper Challenge. It's a game where a message is passed from person to person with small changes occurring each time. And it's often led to confusing, surprising, and sometimes amusing outcomes. It's a little like that for units of competency, except the chains of equivalent units is a process where workplace outcomes are passed from unit to unit, with small changes occurring each time, with confusing, surprising, but I'm afraid never amusing outcomes. It's fundamentally that we're dealing with a situation now where it's not a game, it's serious, and we have to make sure that the shift in meaning and the shift in outcomes and the shift in requirements over a number of successive units of competency hasn't ultimately led to a significant change in meaning. And that does mean that although the first step, the first equivalent step, can be handled automatically and indeed administratively, if you are looking at a person coming to you with a unit of competency, which is a number of steps down in the chain of equivalence, then under those circumstances, you as an RTO are going to need to do some research to establish whether or not what they're asking for credit is in fact truly identical in purpose and function and form to the unit of competency for which they are seeking credit. So we have that situation where we're fundamentally setting down the principle that if the unit of competency is immediately preceded by an equivalent unit, that equivalent unit can be used for credit. But as soon as you go to 2 or more steps, that is an equivalent of an equivalent, or even in some cases that it can go down to 4 steps we've seen, then under those circumstances, what you would have is a situation where the change from the old unit to the current unit might indeed be really significant. And under those circumstances, you would need to carry out a mapping, as it was said before, to establish if there were any gaps. Now, we looked at this to find out whether or not this was a significant kind of problem, because if you are looking at a string of units of competency, each equivalent to the other, it might be hoped, at least, that there were very little changes going on. And indeed, sometimes the changes that occurred between one version of the unit and another is just grammatical or punctuation. Sometimes it was a change in format because the change of format of units of competency shifted at one particular point in time. So that in some circumstances, you might even argue that the changes were cosmetic, just in terms of appearance, rather than being real changes that needed to be considered in terms of maintaining the integrity of the unit of competence. So we looked at a sample of, we looked at all 55 or 54 training packages. There were 45 training packages where units of competency were chained. By that I mean there were equivalences of equivalences of equivalences. Sometimes those equivalence chains were only 2 or 3 units long, sometimes as long as 4 or 5. The analysis of that was conducted only looked 4 deep, and that was partly because, generally speaking, very units of competency did not provide on training.gov the detail of the unit of competency, so analysis could not be done. You would find that there was a unit of competency, but the field containing the elements and performance criteria and other components was blank. That information was not available. So where information was available, we looked at 45 chains of units of competency across 45 training product packages. And what we found were that 29 of the 45, there were significant gaps between the current unit and the unit that had been superseded twice or more. That's 64% of the time there were significant shifts. And those significant shifts basically meant that if a person presented you with a unit of competency that was perhaps a decade old, then the content of that unit of competency and its workplace outcomes will have changed significantly between the time that that unit was achieved and the content of that unit that was achieved and the current unit and its content. And under those circumstances, it would be very risky to simply award credit automatically. So what we found was that there was a significant risk in assuming that the process of automatically awarding credit would be safe. And the sort of changes that we saw were particularly in terms of safe work practice and new technology. And one would be not surprised to see new technology a significant shift, but also new work practices and safety requirements and safety management of a safe working environment were significant differences between the old units and the new units. And under those circumstances, what you can see is that there could be some significant risks in automatically awarding credit for a unit that had significant gaps compared to the current requirements of the current unit of competency. So when we think about gaps, we need to ask ourselves, what could these gaps be? Well, if we think about it, the best way of identifying gaps is by doing a close analysis of the components of a unit of competency. And so firstly, any change in an element of competency, including the addition, deletion, or alteration of performance criteria, would constitute a gap. As soon as you add or delete or reword or change a performance criterion in an element of competency, you have actually changed the element of competency. It is not as it was, it is now something new. And under those circumstances, what you have is a significant change. Knowing how significant that change is would need to be done not by an administrator, but by a subject matter expert who could say whether or not the change was merely a change of expression or was in fact a change that had significant impact on the outcomes. You might find, for example, that two performance criteria have been welded together to form a kind of double unit performance criterion, or sometimes you might find two components performance criteria being split into two separate performance criteria. Those changes are not likely to mean that the element has changed, even though the format of the element has changed. So there has to be a judgment made as to whether or not the change, which is an addition, deletion, or alteration, actually means that the outcome is different. There could be a change in the function of a component. And what this basically means is that you sometimes find that something that was once a performance criterion has been moved into being a knowledge requirement, or something that was a knowledge requirement in the past has been moved to become a performance criterion. And those sorts of circumstances, the words might be the same, but the way it works will be different. So having knowledge about something is different to being able to do something. And so you might argue that in the past, the learners learnt about the knowledge requirement of that particular aspect, but the current students are expected to be able to not just know about it, but to be able to be actually perform it. And once again, you have to make a judgment, again, an expert judgment, as to whether that shift from knowledge to performance criterion, or performance criterion back to knowledge, or from performance evidence into it might become an element of competency. You have to make a judgment as to whether or not that change has changed the fundamental meaning of the unit of competency. If it hasn't, then you can say that it's not a gap. But if it has changed the fundamental meaning of that unit of competency, then you have identified a gap. Then thirdly, there's any component that is currently acquired by the current unit that is not in the unit claim for credit. This is pretty straightforward. It's basically saying if there's an element in the new unit that is not in the old unit, that's a gap. If there's an item of knowledge that's in the new unit that is not in the old unit, then that's a gap. So fundamentally, what you're wanting to make sure is that there is everything that is in the current unit can be found in the old unit, notwithstanding the fact that it might be there, but under a different heading and in a different part of the unit of competency. So there's a bit of detective work involved in that. So let's have a look at mapping as a process. Fundamentally, the question that we're trying to answer here is everything required in the current unit required in the superseded unit. And the only way we can answer that is by doing a mapping. Now, I reiterate that if the unit is immediately superseded, if they're offering a unit that immediately supersedes the current unit, then a mapping does not need to be done. You can administratively and automatically award credit for that immediately superseded unit. But a mapping does need to be done, and the evidence from our research looking at the changes that occur, a mapping does need to be done if they're putting up a unit of competency that has been superseded on more than 2 occasions, or 2 or more occasions. And so fundamentally what you need to do is with your mapping, is to compare to 2 units of competency, the one that the person has achieved and the one that is a current requirement of the current training product. And that is illustrated as a process in the fact sheet training product equivalence. But I'm going to suggest to you that there's a relatively quick way of dealing with this. You want to make a comparison between the 2 units. And what I suggest you do is that you print out the current unit of competency. I know that's a bit old-fashioned, printing stuff out, but it's much easier to mark it up if you print it out. And then bring up on the screen, probably through training.gov, the old version that is being offered to you as a basis of credit by a student applicant. And what you basically need to do is go from the current unit and look for each component in the old unit. You're only really trying to establish is everything required in the current unit required. And under those sort of circumstances, what you can do is mark with highlight or with pencil or whatever anything that is not in the old unit, so that you end up with your new unit, your printed version of the new unit, the current unit. You have on that version highlighted each of the bits that are missing from the old unit. And in that way, you can then start asking the question, well, does this really matter? Are these changes merely aesthetic or cosmetic, or are these changes significant in terms of workplace outcomes? That set of highlighted outcomes are the potential gaps, and in a moment or two we're going to have a look at how you might deal with those gaps. But it is important to understand that whilst the normal process of credit can be done as an administrative process, and under those circumstances is low cost to you and potentially to the student, this process is going to require expertise, subject matter expertise, because a judgment has to be as to whether the gaps that have been identified are significant gaps in terms of the credibility and integrity of the current unit of competency. So what we might do is then look at an example of where this has been done. And this was done with, as mentioned before, 45 units of competency across the 45 training packages. But just taking the RII MPO 318 unit of competency, the current version is F, and it is current since 2021. It was preceded by one in 2018, and that in turn was preceded by a D version in 2015, which was preceded in turn by a B version in 2013. So in 2013, this unit of competency was written. There may have been earlier versions, but we would not necessarily have the text of those. So we're dealing here with just the units of competency for which actual text is available. So in 2013, this unit of competency was written to reflect the requirements of industry in 2013. Not quite a decade later, but, well, in fact, it is now a decade later, but in 2021, the unit of competency had gone through 3 different revisions. And so the F version reflects industry's requirements in 2021. The significant question is, have things changed between 2013 and 2021 in terms of what industry expects of a person who has achieved this unit of competency? And the analysis that we did, which involved the mapping process just described, revealed gaps in the performance criteria, most notably relating to safe work practices, emergency procedures, managing and reporting hazards, communication with others, and completing documentation. Now, these are significant differences, and it would be very difficult to argue that a person with the 2013 version could be awarded credit for the 2021 version because the change is so dramatic. The change between 2018, that is the E version, and the F version is relatively small. And indeed, if they present you with the E version, they can be awarded credit for the F version. And you'll know, of course, that the F version from previous slides has in its mapping section a statement that the E version is equivalent to the F version. But the B version is not equivalent to the F version. The B version has changed significantly. Each of the changes between these versions has been small, but the overall change has become very significant. And notice the nature of the changes relating to safe work practices, emergency procedures, managing and reporting hazards. Those are significant components, which could mean that the capability and the competency of an individual who achieved the 2013 version may well be, in fact, well short of what's expected of a person who has done the 2018 or 2021 versions. So clearly, if a person presents the 2015 version or they could not be automatically awarded credit. You'd do an analysis through a mapping, and through that mapping you'd be able to establish whether or not the version that they are presenting was truly equivalent. And that analysis involves looking carefully at the gaps or 4 gaps between the version being offered and the version currently required. So when we start looking at this, we start asking the question, well, what can you do if there are gaps? So for a start, if there are gaps, then you cannot award credit. So you have to basically say, well, is there any way in which these gaps might actually be filled? Could it be that, and you'll find from time to time that units of competency have been merged or split in order to reflect current industry practices, which may mean that you could look for evidence that the person had achieved the requirements somewhere else in the unit of competency. So you, for example, look for the evidence that elsewhere in the unit to see if this will address the gap. So if there's a performance criterion missing, would that have been picked up in the past in, say, performance evidence? Now that's a change of function because it's gone from performance criterion to performance evidence, but both of them are performance, and therefore you might well argue that that is not a significant change. On the other hand, if the performance criterion has gone and now become knowledge, then you would say, well, that is a significant shift because what they're doing with that quality, that aspect of competency is now quite different. So you can look elsewhere in the unit of competency to see if the gap is addressed in another way. You might even look for evidence of coverage of the gap in other units of competency that have been awarded to the student. So, for example, in the case that we were just talking about, they may have well done a unit of competency relating to safe work practices, emergency procedures, and reporting and managing hazards, which were some of the gaps. They may have even done another unit relating to communicating in the workplace. It may well be that that individual has achieved the qualities that have been required by the new unit of competency, but in a different way. Now, if you find that, then you could award credit because fundamentally what you're saying is this person has all the qualities of competency that we need. But you can see that that's only a judgment that can be made by a subject matter expert, looking not just at the unit of competency that the person is presenting for credit, but other units of competency that they have achieved. You might also consider whether the gap can be incorporated in the training, delivery, and assessment of units to be undertaken by the student. So you might be able to say, well, we can pick up those aspects through the units of competency that the student is about to undertake. And under those sort of circumstances, you might be able to consider that awarding credit would be safe because you are going to make sure that those gaps are addressed in the training that the student is about to undertake. Or, of course, you can offer RPL to the student for the current unit, which is to say, well, these gaps are going to be significant. They're not things that we can find elsewhere in your training. So what we can do is offer you training, or should I say, recognition of prior learning for the current unit. We can use the old unit as evidence of most of the aspects of competency, but where there are gaps, we can do some additional assessment so that we can assess whether or not you do have, in this particular case, the expertise in terms of emergency procedures and safe work practices and communication. And if you can demonstrate those qualities, not only can we won't be giving you credit for the old unit, we'll be awarding you the new unit through an RPL process. But all of these options need to be documented. It really is important that you don't just say, okay, that's fine. Whatever you do, you need to make sure that you keep comprehensive records of your mapping and of the judgment that you've made that has enabled you to either address the gap through looking elsewhere in the unit, or looking at other units of competency, or undertaking targeted training to close the gaps, or where you've offered students. There should be documentation for that, because that would come under your assessment processes and strategies. So you can see that there's going to be the need now not for just an administrative process, but for an expert process. And what we're doing saying to a student is, we're not denying you credit, we're exploring the possibility of credit. And if credit can't be automatically awarded or cannot be awarded on a straightforward basis, then we will look to see if we can preserve the integrity of the current unit of competency through options of this kind. There is a fact sheet that you can go to, the TAC fact sheet on recognition of prior learning. That is, of course, a fallback position that you can take if the individual has a unit of competency and there is no way in which the gaps can be addressed through any of strategies 1, 2, or 3 on this particular slide. So we can see then that credit can be awarded through a number of processes, either automatically if the student has the current unit of competency, and that is in this chart, which comes from the TAC fact sheet on awarding credit. If the applicant holds the current unit or module, then you can grant credit straight. And indeed, you must grant credit because Standard 3.5 says you must. The second option is where the student holds an equivalent unit of competency or an equivalent module that immediately precedes the current unit of module. If they do, then you grant credit. And those two boxes and those two credit granting activities are both administrative. They do not require subject matter expertise because all the information that you need is written in the current unit of competency, either by virtue of its title and code or by its mapping, which refers to a unit with a slightly different title and code because it's a previous version. But when the applicant holds an equivalent module or unit that has been superseded twice or more, then you must go into a mapping process to confirm no gaps exist in the content or learning outcomes between the unit of competency that is already attained by the learner and the unit of competency or module for which the learner seeks an award of credit. And that content, of course, includes the unit of competencies elements, performance criteria, performance evidence, and knowledge evidence requirements, which are, of course, specified in the old unit of competency and in the current unit of competency. And that mapping is a comparison. And you are basically asking the question, do gaps exist? And if there are no gaps, then you can award credit. But if there are gaps, then you need to consider whether or not those gaps can be addressed in any way, or go to RPL process, or enroll them in the training to undertake that unit of competency. So you can see that what we have here is a strategy for preserving the integrity of the training products that are involved, be they units of competency that serve as prerequisites, as core units of competency, or elective units of competency. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to make sure that if credit is awarded, it is done so in a way which means that there are no gaps in an individual's competencies and skill set, knowledge base, so that when a person ultimately graduates, there are no gaps that could cause grief when they go out into the workplace. The process that we've described here means that you can be confident that what you're making is safe and sound decisions, and by documenting that information, the way in which you made those decisions, you can also demonstrate that you have been careful, compliant, and have preserved the integrity of the training products that you're delivering. All of this is backed up in documentation. So we have references that you need to be able to go to. Of course, the standards for RTOs provides an overall umbrella description of what is required. And the integrity of the training products is very much part of all of the components of those standards. There is a TAC user's guide to the standards, which you can use to particularly look, for example, at clause 3.5, which relates to credit transfer. There is a TAC fact sheet awarding credit, and there is a TAC fact sheet on RPL, and there is a TAC fact sheet on training product equivalence. Most recently, there has been the TAC Special Bulletin awarding credit for equivalent units of competency, and that provides not just a reference to a report on credit transfer and equivalence, which relates to that analysis to which I referred of the 45 lines or chains of units of competency. But there's also a report that you can access through the Special Bulletin, which looks at a consultation on RTO and I might just say that that report, and there's a summary of it that's available on the TAC website, said that basically 72% of RTOs that were responded to the survey supported TAC's strong position on the need to do a mapping if the chain of equivalence is 2 or more deep. And the support basically referred to the need for the ability to be able to see that the student still had the current competencies, that is, they still had the capability of performing. As soon as you start looking at very old units of competency, it's quite possible the student might have achieved it but not practiced it since then. And so there were concerns expressed about old units of competency because the student may not have maintained the skill. There were concerns about changes in industry and how industry might have changed in a way which is no longer reflected or is now reflected in the new unit but not reflected in the old unit. And they also referred to the reputation of the RTO, because fundamentally when you make a decision to award credit, you need to be confident that there's a safe judgment, because otherwise it has implications for your credibility as an RTO if you award credit for something for which credit should not be awarded. Okay, I think we can say that we've covered the territory, but you may have further questions, and if you do, then you can contact TAC. Thank you very, very much for participating. Really good that you could be with us this morning. I'm hopeful that this plus all of that documentation will help clarify for you what needs to be done, and that you can find the process not too onerous. I failed to mention, and I should mention, that when I did these mappings, it took me around about 20 minutes to do a thorough, comprehensive, detailed mapping. But certainly each one was very informative, and it would enable one to reach a judgment that whether or not an old unit was equivalent to a current unit, and therefore preserve the integrity of the judgments we make about credit. Thank you very much for participating.